Hello and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. And my guest today is Thomas Kadri, a PhD candidate at Yale Law School and a resident fellow at the Yale Information Society Project. And we're going to be talking about his recent paper, Drawing Trump Naked, Curbing the Right of Publicity to Protect Portrayals of Real People. So welcome, Thomas.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian.
It's all my pleasure. So came across your paper on Twitter and really enjoyed it. And we had a nice conversation there and via email. And I was really looking forward to talking with you a little bit more about some of the interesting and provocative ideas you have about the right of publicity and its intersection with the First Amendment. But, I wanted to address the elephant in the room first, right? In the title of your paper, Drawing Trump Naked, at some risk, what exactly are you referring to there?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a risky endeavor, but I'll try and keep it as PG as I can. The genesis of the title of the paper is came out of a portrait that an artist named Ilma Gore painted back in 2016 in the lead up to the presidential election, and she drew a nude portrait of Donald Trump, then candidate Trump. And this painting, it garnered a decent amount of press attention. It was obviously quite a provocative image, and Trump himself was proving to be quite a provocative political candidate. And these two things kind of came together in a very interesting way that was, picked up in the popular press, more to do with the fact that this painting was kind of spreading over social media, and people thought that it was rather amusing, a sort of satirical sort of piece on Trump. And the reason why I chose it as a title for my paper is because it really, for me at least, it gets to the heart of what the interesting legal issue is that I'm trying to explore here, which is what happens when real people are portrayed in expressive works, in artworks, and even in news articles and other sort of forms of public discourse. What happens when these real people are portrayed against their will, without giving permission? And the case of Ilma Gore and her portrait, which is titled "Make America Great Again" after the Trump slogan. The reason why it's so interesting, and why it ties into the right of publicity, which we can unpack a little more in a second, but it's because Trump, his legal team, apparently threatened to sue the artist over her painting, and so it raises a very interesting question about how much power do people have to stop other people, particularly artists, from portraying them against their will.
Right. So just to clarify, did Trump or his legal team specify the kind of suit that they were going to bring, and did they actually ever end up bringing any kind of claim against the artist?
They never brought a claim, but Gore has sort of said in various interviews, and I actually had the chance to speak with her and interview her myself as well, which was a really interesting opportunity. But her sort of team was, I can't remember if it was her directly or her gallery, but somebody was contacted by Trump's legal team, and basically saying that this painting was done without his permission and that there could be legal consequences. She never sort of specifies whether, the legal team used the words right of publicity, or whether it was more just a sort of thinly veiled sort of threat to try and get some sort of reaction out of her. But certainly there are people who would think that this could raise a right of publicity claim, even if, and as the paper goes into a little bit, even if there was some sort of defense to liability, the actual terms of the tort itself, the right of publicity tort, most states that have this legal right, that recognize this right of publicity, a portrait of Trump would definitely be covered under the right, and then you might need to think about whether there was some defense to it. But it raises a right of publicity claim just by its sort of very nature of being a portrait of somebody else, presumably without their permission if they're going to be threatening to sue.
Right. Yeah. And that makes sense to me that a right of publicity claim would be the most obvious route for Trump's lawyers to have taken. So for listeners who may not be familiar with this tort, maybe you could explain a little bit about it. Like, what is the right of publicity? Where does it come from and what's it for?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with where it is right now, and then we can kind of orient ourselves with a little bit of history. But the right of publicity now refers, at its maybe broadest to, it's a state law tort that prohibits the unauthorized use of a person's name or likeness or various other identifying characteristics. Sometimes it includes things like an autograph, it can include voice, and the reason why I'm sort of equivocating a little bit on exactly what it includes is because being a state law right, different states define this in different ways. Some states have codified it through statutes, others recognize it as a common law right. But at its most general level, it is the right to prevent other people from using your name or some other identifying characteristic without your permission. And it has a sort of interesting history. One story that often gets told is that the right of publicity grew out of the right of privacy, or maybe the better way to put it would be that it grew out of the perceived limitations of a right of privacy. Mm-hmm. And under this story, the idea is basically that, in the early 20th century at least, there was a sort of movement to try and have a right of privacy be recognized in a sort of Warren and Brandeis type model of a right to be let alone, a right to be sort of free from the public eye, but that if you were already a celebrity or somehow famous, it was difficult to fit that within the privacy rubric because you actually enjoy being in the public eye to a certain extent. You are known. It seems sort of strange to talk about your right to be let alone from publicity. And so according to sort of some tellings of this story, the right of publicity grows out of the perceived limitations of the right of privacy, because what the sort of celebrity plaintiff wants when somebody is using their name or their image in a way that, that they didn't grant permission for, they don't necessarily want to be let alone. They want control. They maybe want profits, they want a share of whatever is being made out of the use of their likeness, or maybe they want to prevent the use altogether because they want to be the ones who are exploiting their image and they don't want other people to be able to do it. So that's one story, but the reason why I'm sort of referring to it in that sort of contested way is that a very important work just got released in this past year by Jennifer Rothman, who's, I think most people would accept that she's sort of the current leading sort of scholar on right of publicity issues. And she tells a somewhat different story about how actually, the right of publicity has always had these roots in privacy, and that the right of publicity need not be limited to only famous people. And in fact, that it could and should play a more important role in protecting the rights of everyday citizens, whether or not they are famous, whether or not they're in the public eye, and we can kind of unpack that a little bit because it turns out to be quite important to what I do in the paper. But the gist of it is that all of us have some sort of right to prevent the unauthorized use of our images. And figuring out the contours of what that right is, maybe it will matter on some level whether you are a public figure or not, but that there is some sort of inherent privacy-based or dignitary-based interest that all of us have, and so the sort of the publicity and privacy dichotomy that some people point to maybe isn't the best way to think about it.
Right. Okay, so we've got this inherent sort of like dialectic, almost as it were, between privacy and publicity, and it seems like in a lot of ways we talk about them as separate issues, but from your description it sounds like there's an awful lot of overlap between the two concepts? And
yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one reason why a lot of people want to separate out publicity rights from privacy rights is I think a fairly actually sensible reason, which is that traditionally the right to privacy was thought of as protecting against sort of the emotional harms that one might suffer for an invasion of privacy, and this particular form of invasion of privacy is this sort of loss of control over one's own image, or the feelings that you would feel if you were portrayed against your will. But really, what was going on was that it was a sort of emotional harm, and the rights, particularly the rights to damages and the rights to certain kinds of equitable relief, would sort of flow from the harm, and you could get monetary damages based on the pain and suffering that you had, or things of that nature. Whereas the right of publicity was seen much more through the lens of property, and this makes some sense, particularly because a lot of states recognized this right of publicity as only being applicable to commercial uses of somebody's name or likeness. Now, there's all sorts of interesting things that we can unpack about what commercial means in this context, but just kind of taking it at its simplest form, if your name or likeness is being used in an advertisement, for example, then part of what your damages might be is the reputational costs, yes, and maybe some emotional damages, but really it's about the lost endorsement that you could have had were you to be the person who appeared in the ad with permission, and got a cut of whatever endorsement fee there would be, or something that again is more kind of seen in this property like way that is very different to the emotional injury that people traditionally thought about as being wrought by privacy invasions.
Right, and that's a fantastic summary, I think, of the sort of theoretical relationship between the two. And I'm especially interested to focus on the right of publicity for a moment. I mean, as you say, it's typically characterized as a kind of property-like commercial right. But I'm wondering, in practice, how do people actually use it, right? So when we talk about the right of publicity, or when people invoke the right of publicity in a complaint, and when courts decide right of publicity cases, what do people actually use it for?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it actually really gets to the heart of both why this area is so interesting to me, at least, but also some of the real tension in the doctrine. And that's because in a lot of ways, the sort of quintessential right to publicity claim is very commercial, in the sense that it arises when some famous person's name is used on an ad as a not so thinly veiled way of making the product that they're trying to sell more appealing to the general public. And so one of the examples that often, and I also mentioned it in the paper, is a famous lawsuit between Michael Jordan and a grocery chain. And this grocery chain wanted to sort of honor Michael Jordan for, I think it was when he was maybe inducted into the Hall of Fame, or maybe he had just won another championship or something. They wanted to sort of celebrate this famed basketball star, and they sort of did so in an ad that drew attention to their grocery store and to the products that they were trying to sell there, and did so in a way that was I would say quite clever from a marketing standpoint. They weren't sort of too brash about it. They said, we want to congratulate Michael on his successes. They didn't say Michael Jordan endorses our product. They didn't say it's his favorite grocery store or anything like that. It was just by the mere association with this famous person, they hoped to increase some goodwill towards their store, or whatever else it may have been. And so in a lot of ways that is the classic right of publicity claim. But as I try and show in the paper, and I'm certainly not the first person to point this out, but I think it does cut against what a lot of people assume about the right of publicity. It is by no means limited to these kind of purely commercial settings. Very often what we see, and I would say increasingly these days, is the right of publicity being used against creators of expressive works who probably don't like the portrayals that they're seeing in movies, in video games, in cartoons, and in case after case, over the course of the last, let's just call it 10 years or so, we've seen plaintiffs coming forward and bringing these publicity suits against the creators of these works. And it really complicates what I think for many years was the prevailing story, and part of the reason why the right of publicity was maybe allowed by courts to grow and grow was because there was some sense that, well, the tort is inherently limited because all we're really dealing with here are false endorsements in ads, and that just seems sort of, that seems fair, and it doesn't seem to raise as many free speech concerns if that's all we're trying to do. We're trying to prevent, consumer deception and sort of depriving somebody of big endorsement contracts. Don't worry, this type of a tort will never really impact the free, circulation of ideas and expression in art, because that's just not what this tort is about. But as I try and show in the paper, that story, at least from my perspective, is sadly a misguided one when you look at what's actually happening out there.
Yeah, so I mean, it's easy from your description there. It's easy to see how this sort of bleed over into a privacy-like function seems to be taking place. And so far as the sort of historic conception of the right of publicity seems to be as sort of a way of divvying up the value of celebrity goodwill. But it sounds like a lot of the uses that you're talking about stray into privacy territory of preventing speech rather than divvying up the profits associated with speech. And as you note, that does seem to raise some real First Amendment tensions. So what have courts tried to do to resolve those tensions?
Well, the landscape right now in the courts is frankly muddled, to put it mildly. We have a variety of different tests that have been developed in various different jurisdictions to try and square the right to publicity with the right to free speech. And part of the reason why this confusion has really been able to take hold is that the Supreme Court has given almost no guidance to lower courts about what this analysis should even look like. So the one and only time that the court has waded into the right of publicity was a case called Zucchini, which was decided many years ago now in the 70s, and this was a case involving a human cannonball. Zucchini, who did this sort of daredevil trick at a fair where he was shot out of a cannon, and Zucchini's act was captured by a local news channel, and they aired the act on the nightly news, and Zucchini sued and said, what are you doing? This is my act, this is my livelihood, and by showing it on the TV, you're injuring me in a sense that maybe people will be less likely to come and see the act, or I want a cut of the sort of proceeds of the fact that you have portrayed me in this way without my permission. And we could talk all day about Zucchini. It's a really interesting decision, but for our purposes here, the main thing to say is that the court recognized that states do have an interest in protecting some form of a right of publicity. In this particular case, the court sort of seemed to take pains to talk about how this was a broadcast of a performer's entire act. They kept using these words. It's an entire act. It's not. They didn't focus as much on using Zucchini's face or his likeness or anything like that. It was this idea that he was a performer, and the entirety of what he did in his performance was aired without his permission. But the court didn't really say much more about how exactly we should square this right of publicity, which states have some ability to recognize, with the mandates of the First Amendment, and basically just said, you need to carefully consider the balance, and you need to arrive at a place that that will allow a right of publicity claim but not infringe on free speech. And so that, of course, is no guidance at all, really. And so what has happened is that various courts have developed these tests, and I'll very quickly nod at a few of them, even though this isn't the focus of the paper. But one that is particularly influential these days is the so-called transformative use test. And the idea behind that test is that if the likeness or the indicator of somebody's identity is sufficiently transformed from what it actually is in real life, well, then there would be First Amendment protection there. And the basic idea of that is there's something more creative if you're transforming the likeness. It also is less likely to interfere with the identity holder's ability to use their likeness in the way that they want, because it doesn't look so similar to what they do, or it doesn't sound as similar to what they, the way that they sound. So that's one test that often gets used. Others have focused on, for example, whether the predominant purpose of the use of somebody's name or likeness was to explain, these sort of very vague ideas of why you were trying to use somebody's image. And then there have been other standards that are much more speech protective, that essentially look at whether what is going on is actually a sort of a disguised commercial endorsement. And so really the courts are all over the place. And part of what I'm hoping to do in this work is to take aim at one particular form of inquiry that goes on here surrounding newsworthiness, and look at how that's being applied, and then to draw from that certain lessons about, in fact, how the First Amendment should really, deal with these kinds of claims when they're brought against the creators of expressive works.
Right. So, this is a familiar story in a lot of ways, right? This kind of First Amendment tension arises in the context of all different kinds of information goods, from copyright to trademark to trade secret, you name it. But it seems like the sort of submerged privacy element still present in the right of publicity tort creates a new wrinkle in a way that I thought was really interestingly reflected in your paper. Maybe you could talk about a little bit about how you try in your paper to engage with the tensions specific to the right of publicity.
Certainly. So, I think the first thing to say is that from the very beginning of when, Warren and Brandeis first wrote their very influential law review article about a right to privacy that they felt, did in some sense and certainly should exist within the common law, one of the first limitations that they sought to put on that right would be that it shouldn't interfere with free speech. And the way that they sort of envisioned that limitation on a right of privacy would be that, well, this would never interfere with the discussion of matters that are in the public interest. And that all sounds, perfectly sensible, and something that is, generally reflective of maybe what our views of the First Amendment mean in this country. At the very least, you need to be free to talk about public issues, matters of public concern, and that no right of privacy should be able to overcome that right that we all have under the First Amendment. And so this has been a big part of other privacy torts. So, for example, the privacy tort that deals with disclosures of embarrassing facts, deals with this kind of concept of newsworthiness. It may be very embarrassing for, to go back to, the person who partly inspired this paper, maybe very embarrassing for Donald Trump's business about what he did or didn't do with Stormy Daniels to be all over the news, but I don't think anybody thinks he would have any chance at a privacy-based claim saying, well, this is really embarrassing to me and I don't want it out there in the public eye. The response would very swiftly be, no, this is a matter of public interest. It's very important for the public to know, or the public is in fact very interested in this, and therefore it needs speech protection. So this idea of privacy and speech as kind of butting up against each other goes right back to the very foundations of the privacy torts. And so in that sense, you're right. It's not surprising that it comes up in this slightly different variation of the privacy tort. Call it a right of publicity, or call it misappropriation, as it sometimes is talked about. Because again, there's this sense that the way that the right is defined, you can't use my, let's narrow it. You can't use my name without my permission. Well, of course, that's absurd. If that were actually a rule that were 100% enforced, society would crumble within 2 seconds, like we all the time. We use people's names without their permission. And I'm not just talking about, in the news articles of reporting about things, I'm talking about everyday life. So the tort can't possibly mean exactly what it says. And so then it becomes about trying to understand what it plausibly can cover, and that is where that is where these sort of limitations on the privacy rights that we've seen in other contexts become quite important to the right of publicity as well, and how we understand its limits.
Right. So one of the things I thought was interesting was the way you talked about some of these traditional theories of kind of First Amendment values or First Amendment carve-outs to privacy rights in particular, like kind of an educative theory or a kind of public discourse oriented theory, and kind of highlighted the normativity of those
right.
that suggested some limitations to them as a approach to protecting the kinds of First Amendment values that we want to protect.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, the way that I think about First Amendment theory is that certainly the leading First Amendment theorists, they follow a kind of values doctrine case sort of progression of thinking. So you identify what values the First Amendment protects, or what principal value it protects, and from that will flow a certain type of doctrine, and from that doctrine will help you decide particular cases. And so it becomes very important to select the right value that underlies the First Amendment, because it will have those ripple effects down the line. And these are certainly normative judgments. I mean, the idea that we can really know what is encompassed by a phrase, as sort of open textured as the freedom of expression or freedom of speech, just by its terms, is that this is not something that is open to obvious sort of textual interpretation. And in fact, the First Amendment, just as a bit of a side note, is among the constitutional rights that we hold so dear here, is one of the ones that is sort of least frequently talked about in terms of, well, what do the words actually mean? Because there are plenty of things, for example, that are covered by the free speech clause that aren't what we would traditionally think of as being speech. It is also obviously true that not all speech raises constitutional concerns, or not all sort of prohibitions of speech raise constitutional concerns. So this kind of complicates everything. But what it means, as I said, is that picking having a theory of the First Amendment and deriving values from that will have a lot of different effects for the doctrine that flows from it. And so if you take the educative model, which, as I unpack a little in my paper, is this idea that what the First Amendment really is all about is it's a very listener-focused right. It's about informing the public, educating the public about matters that they need to, know and understand in order to be informed voters, in order for self-government. Well, that sounds very good. That sounds like it would be quite a speech protective rule, and it is, but it also has limitations, because if all you care about is getting information out to the listeners, it doesn't really matter who speaks, or to maybe put a finer point in it, it doesn't really matter that everybody gets to speak. What matters is that the important things get said. And so this enables certain types of rules. If that is what the First Amendment protects, and it is only what the First Amendment protects, then it might allow certain regulations of certain types of speakers, or the amount of speech that everybody can do, or the ways in which people can speak. Because if at the end of the day you can justify the regulation by saying, well, the listener is getting all the information that they need, or the listener is getting the information in the way that is most conducive for them to get it, well, then the First Amendment is being satisfied there. So it can really matter whether you choose, more of a listener-based model, or more of a speaker-based model, or something that maybe honors both speaker and listener. And that, I think, is as I try and unpack that sort of tension within First Amendment theory actually explains a lot of the contours of the current doctrine in the right of publicity. The right of publicity cases have often seen free speech through this listener-focused lens, and not paid as much attention to the rights of speakers to be able to engage in public discourse.
Yeah, and one of the things that really struck me about that was how the framing really affects the scope of speech that's going to be protected. I mean, normally I think we sort of intuitively think of the right to free speech as putting the burden on the government to justify the suppression of speech, which leads, I think, inexorably to a kind of a really broad right. But shifting the burden onto the speaker, as we seem to do in a lot of these right of publicity cases, really changes the contours of what the right looks like in a way that, we wouldn't see in another context. So it seems like what you're pointing to is this idea that if you're using somebody's name and likeness in the context of some form of speech, all of a sudden the onus is on the speaker to justify that use, rather than on the spoken about to justify its suppression.
That's absolutely right. This is a strange area of the law for many reasons, but the one that you just pointed to is perhaps the strangest of all. If a state were to pass a new law tomorrow, as in fact they frequently do try and do, let's say criminalizing types of revenge porn, that actually those laws serve sometimes very similar values to a privacy-based, misappropriation or right of publicity kind of claim. You want other people to stop using your image without your permission. All of these revenge porn statutes, for example, the analysis follows traditional First Amendment scrutiny, which is to say the government has passed this law. It circles out certain types of speech based on its content, and therefore it needs to satisfy the demands usually of strict scrutiny, which is the kind of one of the main tests that you would use in First Amendment law to determine whether a law that restricts speech on the basis of its content, whether it can withstand constitutional scrutiny. Exactly as you said, the burden is put on the state to justify why a law that does that should be deemed constitutional, whereas in the right of publicity context, it has it backwards. There is this sort of assumption that the right of publicity is legitimate and that you have a right to stop other people from using your identity without your permission. But it's then kicked over to the creator of the expressive work, for example, the painter or the movie maker or the documentarian or the journalist, to justify why that particular use deserves First Amendment protection. And that, to me, seems entirely backward when you look at the grander scheme of First Amendment jurisprudence.
Right. So I want to return to talk about some of these hard cases like revenge porn and deep fakes, which you talk about a little bit in your paper. But before we get there, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your suggestions about how we might think more productively about this relationship between First Amendment values and the right of publicity and the sort of privacy interests embedded in it.
Yeah, so I guess to build a little bit on what I was saying before about the limitations of a listener-based model, to me, the speech interests at stake, they begin to make more sense when you look at the First Amendment as guaranteeing, to some extent, a speaker-based right, and particularly when it comes to public discourse. And so public discourse is an idea that really the Supreme Court has has developed, and other theorists have given various glosses to it. But the way that I use the term, following others like Robert Post, who's somebody who I work with at Yale, but also James Weinstein and other scholars, is to think of public discourse as being both the types of speech that are essential to the formation of public opinion. So speech on matters of public concern, you can think about it as being to do with the content of speech as being important. But more importantly for my purposes here, there are certain mediums through which we communicate. This is a sort of a sociological matter. There are ways in which we, as humans, communicate with each other and form public opinion, and a big part of that is by recognizing the mediums through which we do that. And one of the mediums through which we do this is things that we might think of as art. So we do it through movies, we do it through music, we do it even through paintings, even though this isn't speech in the sense that anybody is speaking, and it's not even speech in the sense necessarily that there's anything written on it, but we are conveying ideas, and we are engaged in sort of the formation of public opinion through these mediums. And this public discourse model is really important, because if something falls within public discourse, then there is case law to suggest that it receives a sort of presumption of First Amendment protection that maybe other types of speech would not get. That's not to say that there are no limitations that can be put on public discourse, but it is the case that there are certain types of limitations that usually will not withstand constitutional scrutiny. And this really is where the rubber hits the road with the right of publicity, is that there are probably certain types. People often ask me when they hear me talk about the right of publicity, or when they read the paper, well, are there any times when the right of publicity should prevail over free speech? Is what you're really arguing for here a blanket rule that just says the right of publicity needs to disappear and go away? And that, the short answer is that can't possibly be the case, because the one and only Supreme Court case we have was a case where speech in public discourse, a news report, was held to be subject to the right of publicity, and that the First Amendment wasn't going to block it. So we know that there must be at least some times when the right of publicity can prevail over the First Amendment within public discourse, but figuring out when that is really the crux of the paper. And so there are various interests that the right of publicity could be said to serve. Some of them I don't think I buy, but whether I buy them or not is in some sense beside the point. The bigger question is whether they are the types of interests that we recognize as being sort of legally valid within public discourse. And this is where we might end up with a slightly strange situation, I would say, from what maybe some of our intuitions might be, which is that it may be that within public discourse, we recognize that there can be certain incentives-based rationales, like were at play in the Zucchini case that I mentioned, the human cannibal case, where even if it's within public discourse, even if it's a news broadcast, there was some sort of interest that the state was furthering to have performers do their performances and put those out to the public that would be so devalued if even the news media could broadcast the entirety of that act, that the state has an interest there that overcomes the First Amendment. Whereas conversely, usually within public discourse, we don't allow for regulation based on the idea that particular speech harms somebody's dignity or hurts their feelings. And so here you have examples like Hustler v. Falwell, a famous First Amendment case involving a sort of a public figure, Jerry Falwell, who was portrayed in a parody ad in Hustler magazine in very offensive ways, and he sued and said this caused me severe emotional distress. And the doctrinal importance of that case basically is that the court said, no, this is something that was within public discourse. And in public discourse, speech is often really mean. You are subject to caustic attacks. And that's just part of free speech. And so while maybe publicity claims could survive if they are furthering particular interests based on giving incentives within public discourse, even that might be fine. But purely hurting somebody's feelings or being, even particularly outrageous conduct might not be enough. And that's where it gets very interesting with some of the contemporary challenges that the right of publicity might be thought to address.
Yes, I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit in the context of your discussion of some of these hard cases, because it strikes me that what really came across to me in your paper was this sense that there are some kinds of speech which, for a non-public person, the right of privacy would be an appropriate means by which to prevent certain kinds of disclosures or certain kinds of speech about a person. And yet, invoking the right of privacy for a public figure, someone like Jerry Falwell or, say, President Trump, just doesn't really make the same kind of sense. And I'm wondering, are there contexts where it might be potentially consistent with the First Amendment to permit some sort of privacy-like invocation of the right of publicity, or should we err toward rejecting that entirely?
Yeah, I'm certainly not willing at this point to say that we should reject it entirely. I think it's very difficult to thread the needle sometimes, but I think that there are certain types of privacy interests that the right of publicity could further even within this context of public discourse. So this paper, certainly starts to try and take a stab at it, but I think it would require maybe a whole other paper to really, really unpack it. But, there are privacy interests, I think, at stake when the revenge porn cases, I think, are some of the ones that come to mind most significantly, where if you are portraying somebody there against their will, and you are sending them threatening, you're sending out these videos without their permission. Well, that might be an example where you're disclosing something that really there was such a strong expectation and a sort of a societal norm against sharing something like that you got from somebody, that maybe the privacy interests might be able to prevail over some sort of speech defense. But it becomes very, very difficult because you start going back to drawing these lines about whether a public figure maybe has fewer rights than a private individual. But ultimately, that is, I happen to think that is unavoidable in privacy law. Privacy law is so bound up in societal norms and expectations that in fact gives the contours of what the right of privacy really can cover. And so to say that it's going to be context dependent is in fact not a slight on the right of privacy. It's something inherent about a right of privacy, that it is going to be context dependent, and it's going to be based very much on societal norms about what sort of information disclosures are or aren't appropriate. And so that's something that I think the right of publicity is grappling with, even though a lot of people think about it not as a privacy issue at all. I think that's when we start seeing that at its core there are privacy interests at stake in a lot of these cases.
Yeah. Okay. So in a way, I think you actually kind of just answered this next question I want to ask in a kind of broader theoretical way, but I was hoping you could touch on it more directly, because it's something that's been bothering me after reading your paper, and I don't have an answer to it, right? So you talk a little bit about deep fakes, right? Or these pornographic videos where people put someone else's face, usually a celebrity's face, on an image of of someone having sexual intercourse as a way of making it look like they're in a pornographic movie. And I can't help but compare the idea of a deep fake to the painting that you're the drawing, that use of Donald Trump naked, with which you start your paper. And I guess my intuition is that the Donald Trump painting should be protected, but my intuition about deep fakes is much weaker. Right? I'm much less sympathetic, or, it's a struggle for me to get to the idea that that should be protected as well, but I don't know why.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that tension is really at the heart of the paper in many ways, because I think a lot of people's reaction to why the Trump painting should be protected is, well, that's core political speech in some way. It's a commentary on Trump and, his bravado and whatever else. There are certainly stories that you can tell to explain why that is valuable speech to be out there in public discourse, or why it would be kind of crazy to think that the government could punish somebody for drawing that. I think a lot of people would find that to be the case. But if some other public figure, perhaps a much more sympathetic one, were portrayed in a sort of a deep fakes video, also to be in the nude, what sort of, it becomes a lot harder to draw those lines, and it's not as easy as just saying, well, if it's a private figure, then maybe different rights should attach, and we could have a whole discussion about that. But as you probably know, a lot of these sort of from reading the paper, a lot of these deep fakes are also celebrities who are portrayed in these deep fake videos, and so you can't just draw a line between public figures and private figures as one that would support that intuition. So for me, this is what makes deepfakes such a complicated one, because I think a lot of people have a very understandable impulse to think that the law should be able to do something to remedy the undoubted harm that comes from them, right? So nobody, I think, is discrediting the fact that there is a harm that is wrought by these videos. The question is whether you can nonetheless regulate them consistent with the First Amendment. And my thinking on this, frankly, has shifted from time to time, because I have tried to figure out a way that consistent with the doctrine you could regulate these deep fakes, and where my mind is at, now with it, is that there may be certain types of outrageous dignitary injuries that are caused by, or I should say, there may be certain types of dignitary injuries that are caused by particularly outrageous uses of somebody's image, such that it would take it out of public discourse, because even public discourse, where generally we think of it as, there are no kind of markers of Queensberry rules, but even within public discourse, you need a certain degree of civility in order for public discourse to serve its function, in order for it to be conducive to the formation of public opinion. But to me, that is an extremely difficult line to draw, and one that I feel quite uncomfortable with. So probably what you can sense in the paper, and undoubtedly what you can sort of hear from me now, is that it's quite an unsatisfying takeaway for me. It's one that it is deeply problematic to me to think that nothing can be done about these videos. But I think it's very difficult to square it with the free speech tradition that we have, that generally doesn't allow for regulation of speech in public discourse based on an idea that it harms somebody's dignity. That's just not the American free speech tradition. So it's very difficult to kind of get around that.
Yeah. So maybe we ultimately can't get away from normativity in speech regulation, but the best we can do is just to be circumspect as possible about it.
I think so. And I mean, one thing I would say is that, when I talk about the issue of deepfakes with people, a lot of the prime examples that people bring up about particularly harmful deepfakes, I think can be addressed by related privacy torts or related sort of legal rights. For example, if the deepfake were very convincing and honestly could, trick people into thinking that somebody had done something that they did not in fact do, well, then we have a false light claim. The idea that you have been portrayed doing something that you didn't do that casts you in a false light. Now, there are certain free speech defenses to those claims too, but at least we have a tort that would maybe address something like that. Similarly, if the same would apply if a deep fake showed you doing something that was defamatory, or in a way that was defamatory, well then yes, you would have a defamation claim, in part because people would actually sort of believe that you had done these things because of the deep fake, or if somebody hacked into, as happened a while ago with hacking into various celebrities' phones and taking photos. If you did that and used those images in order to create a deep fake, I think you would have a privacy claim based on intrusion upon seclusion or something along those lines. The most problematic hypothetical that I'm even hesitant to bring up, because it's to me it's just like, it's so hard and really unsatisfying, but I think it really gets to the heart of it, is the deep fake video that portrays the actress, but before the video starts rolling, a disclaimer comes up at the front and says, this is a deep fake, it is fake, this is not the real celebrity. Now, if I'm the celebrity who is portrayed in that, that may give me some comfort, because at least people will watch it and realize that it wasn't actually me, but it doesn't really go to the heart of why I find it so abhorrent that I'm being portrayed in this way. It's the emotional harm that is wrought upon me by these images that are circulating. It is the harm to my dignity. But I don't know in that situation whether there can be any legal claim that could prevent that use that would be consistent with the First Amendment. I would love to figure out a way to do that consistent with the doctrine, but that is my challenge, is that I've had a very tough time thinking about how that could be.
Yeah. Well, Thomas, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really learned a lot more about the right of publicity and about your ideas in this paper from talking to you about it. I was wondering if you had any kind of final thoughts or key takeaways you would want to leave listeners with.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we are really at an interesting crossroads in the discussion, because people, I think, are paying much more attention to the idea of privacy. Now, that is often in very different contexts to the ones that we've been discussing today. It's about data breaches or what's going on social media or manipulation using sort of people's personal data. But all of this, I think, goes to some really interesting and difficult questions for our society that we're going to need to grapple with, which surround, a distinction between public and private that really doesn't stand up anymore. The idea of what goes on within your own home, that's your sort of private domain, and out in the public, well, that's public and that's anybody's business. It becomes a lot harder in a world in which you can have so much data about somebody. You could track them in ways that you couldn't track them before. There are all sorts of ways in which maybe we might need to have some privacy in public, and yet at the same time, maybe why even in private, some things about us, don't need to remain totally private. And so we're at a really interesting moment. And for me, at least, the right of publicity is one component of that, but it's certainly part of a much bigger question that we need to have as we start to understand, how we can live in this, in the digital age, in a way that, preserves some amount of privacy that I think all of us feel on some level we need in order to function as humans, and yet at the same time to preserve robust public discourse in a way that honors the tradition that we have in this country of free speech. And these are really, really difficult issues, but I think we certainly need to face up to them.
Great. Yeah, well, I look forward to reading your work in the future. I'm sure there's a lot more coming on this subject.
Thank you. This has been really great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Okay, I'll talk to you soon.